Hello everyone, welcome to my review of Dark Souls 3. Now I believe with every single video on my channel, I like to start off with a little bit of prefaced information to kind of explain to people where I come from whenever I'm reviewing a game or just on any real subject, to help you, the viewer, form your own opinions based on what I have to say. However, if you don't want to hear about me or any of the information I have to say that will explain my arguments, you can just skip straight to the actual arguments I'm making, the actual content of the video right now with this annotation. I highly recommend, however, that you don't skip all this prefaced information because it can be a little important. First off, my background in the Souls series. I'm a late entry to the Dark Souls fanbase. I believe I started in 2013, which was just 1 year before Dark Souls 2 was released. I have beaten both Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2 multiple times. I have played Demon Souls and Bloodborne, though I never beat them. Mostly because I can't watch a TV for more than a few hours without my eyes hurting. Please take this into consideration, especially when I'm talking about combat, because I know that Bloodborne's combat probably heavily influenced this game. I'm recording all this preface information before the game is actually finished downloading. As far as my experience with Dark Souls 1 and 2, not only have I beaten them, I've beaten them multiple times, and I've spent over 400 hours in Dark Souls 2 alone. I was a part of the Souls Twitch community for a long time before my inclusion in that little nonsense died, and I share the general consensus opinion that Dark Souls 2 was not as good as Dark Souls 1. However, I do believe that Dark Souls 2 PvP was better. I'm also one of the people who was incredibly disappointed and jaded by the fact that Namco provided pre-release footage that looked way better than the actual game as far as Dark Souls 2 is concerned. Also, one last personal thing about me when it comes to Dark Souls, I'm a person who thinks that Dark Souls should have never had a sequel, and if it did, it should have had sequels that had their own stories in completely different universes or worlds or countries or whatever, that have nothing to do with each other and are just good ways to get a good message across like Dark Souls 1 was. It should be noted, however, I still really love Dark Souls. Dark Souls 1 is my second favorite game of all time, and Dark Souls 2 just disappointed me a lot because it wasn't as good as the first one. This is important to know because as a fan of this series, I'm going to be incredibly critical of it. A lot of people seem to think that fans of a series are going to look at it with tinted glasses, but I believe the opposite is the case. But I think 2 minutes is enough about me. Let me just get into the generic spoiler warnings for this video because we will be going through the entirety of Dark Souls 3, including all of the plot points. We will be doing so chronologically, so if you want to, you can watch some of this video up until the point where we start talking about what you know, and you can stop and go play the game. However, to get the full effect of the video, I will recommend that you actually go and play the game. This is more of a critique than a review, I suppose, but if you're just wondering if you should buy the game or not and are willing to get spoiled a little bit, I guess that you can watch it. If you don't want to get spoiled but you still want to know whether or not you should buy the game, I usually have a conclusive argument towards the end of the video, or series of videos depending on how long this takes, because unfortunately my computer cannot handle more than 1 hour of footage being rendered at a time, in which I will probably be generalizing all the arguments I've made without as many spoilers as the entire video will have together. But as far as right now is concerned, let's play Dark Souls 3. Now, all of the reviews I've made on this channel have been done in chronological order, anything from Fallout 4 to Undertale to Black Desert Online, and Dark Souls 3 will be no exception. We will be starting off this critique with the very first thing we see, the title screen. Just kidding, I'm not that pedantic. I am, however, pedantic enough to start criticizing the game with the opening cinematic. Now, of course, visually, the opening cinematic itself is an incredibly impressive piece of visual art. It probably takes thousands of man and computer hours to generate something like this and to actually animate it and have it move properly, and it shows, and it is very much worth it. It looks awesome. However, there are details about it I did and did not like. The first detail I did like about it is that it generally seems to be following the same archetype that the first one did. The first one being Dark Souls 1 opening cinematic, in which all of the major lore characters are explained to us, and all the major lore events, all the backstory, is also explained to us. Meaning that right off the bat we know who these people were and what they do. Or at least we know who these people are because Dark Souls 3's opening cinematic doesn't really explain much about what anyone has done so far. Other than that, we know that these 3 Cinder guys have left their throne. And yes, I did say Cinder, like Gwyn, the Lord of Cinder, because this game seems to be much more like a sequel to Dark Souls than Dark Souls 2 was, which I don't like. Again, personally, I would prefer if Dark Souls games took place in entirely different continents with entirely different lore each game. Reusing lore is fine, but I honestly just think that it's only done because they want to have an attachment to the previous games, to give the players something to attach onto, to maybe make them think that the game is a little better than it really is. When I first heard about the Lords of Cinder, I really wasn't impressed, nor was I amused. To quote Matthew Matosis, which is a statement that I can agree upon, seeing Dark Souls 3 begin to retread the same stuff that we've already done 2 games now seems incredibly uncreative. I don't think we need to have the Lords of Cinder, and I don't think we need to have the Age of Fire, and I don't think this needs to be in Lordran with a different name. I would have preferred if this took place in a different kingdom, in a different land, with all these same characters who just serve a different purpose other than being the new Lords of Cinder. However, everything else about the cinematic I am personally okay with. The only thing I dislike about it is the fact that we seem to be saying, once again, that Dark Souls 1 ends with the fire ending instead of of the Dark Wraith ending, because I think Dark Souls 1 should have just ended mysteriously without any right or wrong answer. This game sets up a pretty interesting scenario where apparently the new Lords of Cinder have abandoned their throne instead of actually just leaving it, and that now we're aware that the Age of Fire will come to an end and it's now being coveted and protected with some kind of bell. But not only that, because the throne seems to be being abandoned by these Lords of Cinders, or at least that's what the cinematic says, someone seems to be usurping it by taking a crown off a pedestal. I also like how now we seem to be starting off as just some random undead unfit to be Cinder instead of supposedly some kind of ancient ancestor to the furtive pygmy. Considering that the nature of Dark Souls' gameplay, lore, and world are incredibly bleak and unforgiving, I don't think the player being some kind of special star child of some ancient thing is a good idea. I personally like the idea that I'm just some mook who's sent on a quest. However, I do like the fact that the Dark Souls 3 cinematic has a lot more going for it than the Dark Souls 2 cinematic. The Dark Souls 2 cinematic just seems to be some random cutscene about a family that has nothing to do with the player character and a rambling about how we're going to die a lot, and about how Drang Lake is a little bit muddy. This one actually has a story going for it. However, I believe we've talked about the opening cinematic enough, and we should move on to the character customization. The character customization in this game is about as good as it was in Bloodborne, which was better than it was in Dark Souls 2, which was better than it was in Dark Souls 1. The only problem I really have with it is that with a keyboard and mouse, it's incredibly annoying to finagle, because it's designed for a controller and doesn't seem to really support the keyboard and mouse. In fact, I'm seeing a lot of console button prompts in this game, which should not be happening anymore, because this is not Dark Souls 1's terrible port. This is Dark Souls 3. This should not be happening anymore. We've made 3 Dark Souls games on PC. The classes this time around are about as analogous as you could get to the classes from Dark Souls 1. The only thing of note to mention is that the warrior is a Viking and is therefore the best class, and if you disagree with me, you can get out now. The starting gifts are also very interesting. You can start off with what seems like a newbie trap piece of equipment, the Life Ring, which if you've played Dark Souls 1 you'll know is probably a lie, a variety of helpful consumable items, and a cracked red-eye orb if you want to invade people very early on in the game, which is a pretty interesting choice. My guess is that they wanted to give people an early taste of PvP if they're into that kind of thing, and they're playing Dark Souls for the long run, which probably means that they're like Ouroboros or someone and they're playing this for PvP. After we finalize our character creation, we go into another in-game cinematic where we wake up from a grave. At this point in the game, I think the player can generally assume that this means we are in some way connected to the Lords of Cinder and may not be as much of a mook as I was saying earlier, because the opening cinematic stated that the Lords of Cinder were the ones who were waking up and the undead guys were just normal dudes. The unfit seemed to not be waking up for their graves and the fit seemed to do. Of course, we just started the game, so maybe we're wrong for now. And the next thing I want to talk about, which is a pretty controversial topic for the Dark Souls series, is the graphics. It's controversial because Dark Souls 1 looks terrible for a game made in 2011, and Dark Souls 2 obviously had its graphics downgraded from pre-release footage to what we have now. I'm happy to say that Dark Souls 3 not only looks really good, but even without video drivers on my machine, which is running on slightly older hardware, it runs at completely silky smooth 60 frames per second all the time. The port for this game is great, minus the occasional crashing. And by occasionally, I of course mean, all the time. I looked this crash up and it turns out I'm not the only one suffering from it. This seems to be plaguing a lot of users here on PC. Here's the fix, just in case you're suffering from this issue and don't already know about this. You just have to simply turn your lighting quality down to low, not medium, low, and that will for some reason stop the game from crashing. I don't know what this bug is, but hopefully by the time this recording is actually going out on YouTube, this will be fixed. And it wouldn't be the only thing, hopefully, because the online in this game is also very broken. I don't think I can put into words exactly how dysfunctional it is, so I'm just going to play some footage in the background while describing to you exactly what's going on with this. Seems like NPC animations and sometimes even player animations just don't work in online play. It also seems that enemies, including bosses, can't seem to strike phantoms, meaning that they can't do any damage to them, but they can aggro to them, meaning that a player can equip something like the Moaning Shield or use Alluring Skulls and aggro bosses without being able to get hit by them. And if the boss aggroes onto the host, then the phantom can just come up behind and attack the boss without any repercussions. If anything, the phantom would want to have aggro because that means that the player couldn't die, meaning like just as I'm showing you here, you can cheese certain bosses entirely, not just single mechanics, the entire fight, which is obviously a problem. The fact that the game is releasing with problems this absolutely destructive is in my mind no less than just a clear sign of negligence on the part of either Bamco or From Software. If you're looking to get into some online play, then maybe you should wait a little bit until you hear that this issue is fixed, which is assuming that it is by the time that this video goes out, and hopefully it will be. However, to get back on topic, let's go back to graphics. While graphical fidelity usually doesn't matter, this game has a lot of cool little details when it comes to its actual graphics. My current favorite being the fact that your last hit, on occasion, with a melee weapon on some enemies will actually cause a streak of blood to explode out of them in the direction that your sword was swinging on the last hit. The amount of blood is actually quite huge, and it's pretty satisfying to see it fly across the landscape, especially since it seems to permeate until you die or use a bonfire like everything else in the game, meaning that if you got lucky and you slaughtered a bunch of things in one room and you had blood flying all over the place, you can go back to that room if you really want to and just look at it again. It's such a small thing, but it's something I really like. However, I believe we talked enough about pragmatic things and we should start talking about the actual game. After the opening cinematic concludes, we wake up as well, which kind of makes me think that we're a Lord of Cinder, because they said they're the ones waking. It's confusing, let's not think about it. In the Ashen Cemetery. In my opinion, the Ashen Cemetery is actually a fantastic tutorial area. It allows you to either relearn or learn the basic mechanics of fighting in this game, and gives an initial taste of exploration and choice that isn't confusing to new players, even allowing for players to fight an optional mini-boss if they so choose. The skyboxes in this area are really pretty, and there's just something very distinctly Dark Souls about being able to see all the various areas around you that you can actually walk to. Of course, the enemies here aren't anything spectacular, but it's a tutorial area, so I don't know what to expect. Another thing I really like about it is that it gives players who are willing to explore and fight more enemies actual rewards that they can use in-game. 4,000 plus souls and some Titanite is a pretty good start for a Dark Souls game. I just wish they would allow new players to actually level up from the bonfires in this area so that they could actually use these souls they acquired instead of possibly losing them to the first boss. Speaking of the first boss, I think he's a pretty decent, if kind of bland, introduction into this game's combat. The only thing interesting he really does in his fight is transform into this giant snake creature halfway in. Unfortunately, the snake creature is kind of annoying because it covers up the camera and it's way too big. After we kill the snake man, we acquire something called the coiled sword, which originally I thought was a piece of equipment, but is actually a key item. A key item whose description has me a little worried this early in the game, saying that it has something to do with teleportation. We walk up a small hill and into a large coliseum type thing, and we see a sight that is all too familiar for its own good. We walk into what is quite clearly a Demon's Souls style hub area, wherein for the third time we see the Maiden in Black. Not only has the Maiden in Black returned for the third time, but Andre of Astora, quite literally Andre of Astora, has returned for the second time. Not only have the Maiden in Black and Andre returned, but one of the old ladies from the beginning of Dark Souls 2 appears to be back as well. But not only that, the Crestfallen Warrior, albeit with a new voice actor this time around, has returned as well, meaning that of the 5 characters available in the hub at the beginning, 4 of them are repeat. But they're not the only things that are repeating in this. The hub area is quite literally just called the Firelink Shrine again. Seeing this game retread 4 major characters in one major location already has me a little bit on edge. Dark Souls 1 was a great game, but I don't think we should be retreading all of its elements over and over and over again. I found it not only uncreative, but incredibly unbelievable that Dark Souls 2 would have so many elements connected to the first one, despite it taking place in a supposedly different time period in a supposedly different land. And this game is already getting me skeptical about whether or not I'm actually going to get a creative new Dark Souls story, or if I'm just going to retread Dark Souls 1 again. However, at this point we don't know enough about the main plot to actually start judging anything, so I suppose I'll just get into this point later. There's other problems I have here. First off, the Maiden in Black's re-inclusion means that we're going back to Dark Souls 2's leveling system instead of the far superior Dark Souls 1 leveling system. For some reason, From Software insists that going to a bonfire, going through a loading screen, talking to an NPC with front-loaded dialogue, going back to a bonfire, and going through another loading screen is somehow more efficient than just going to a bonfire. Additionally, having a blacksmith at the start of the game is kind of pointless since you don't have enough Titanite shards to actually do anything. Personally, I would have preferred if I could actually go out into the world and find the blacksmith and bring him back to the shrine like the other games allow you to do. Having the character actually be out in the world doing something before the player gets to them makes them feel like they're actually a part of a world instead of just a convenience. But then again, I guess if we were interested in actually having a character for this blacksmith, we wouldn't have made them Andre from Dark Souls 1, would we? In fact, every character at the start of the game just seems like a convenience rather than an actual character, except for the Lord. The last remaining Lord of Cinder is the only person who actually gives the player any amount of plot. He tells us that we are a seeker of lords and need to go get some kindling for the 5 thrones to become a Lord of Cinder to link the fire to preserve the world, which I assume our character must know about because we were at one point dead, meaning that we were at one point alive before all this, meaning that we were probably alive during the Age of Fire, which is some kind of Age of Prosperance. However, how are new players supposed to know what the Age of Fire is? The opening cinematic to Dark Souls 1 explains what the Age of Fire was, but it doesn't explain what the Age of Fire is to new players to Dark Souls 3. Then again, and I will once again get into this later, I think this game was not developed with new players in mind. However, I believe I've prolonged getting into the actual game world long enough. We put the coiled sword into the little bonfire thing and get to warp to our first area. For some reason, Dark Souls 3 would rather have the player warp into the world instead of just walking there like Dark Souls 1, which in my opinion makes the world feel disjointed and not really there, because what's the point of having an entire world laid out if you could just warp around it? However, this is at least the only time this happens, and you can walk to any other part of the world, which is nice. We warp into the first level, the High Wall of Lothric, which finally brings me to the topic of level design in Dark Souls 3. The actual level-by-level design in Dark Souls 3 is actually really great. I would say it's about as good, if not a little bit better than Dark Souls 1. Every single level is absolutely massive and expansive in every way. There's all kinds of optional stuff to go out and search, and there is a genuine amount of adventure to actually be had here in just exploring. The levels are also designed in a way to actually loop back around on themselves through shortcuts, which is great and is a fantastic return to form from Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 2's level design was basically always just a long tunnel that ended in either a dead end with a boss fight, or a boss fight and a doorway leading to another tunnel with a dead end. I would say Dark Souls 3's is more like a branch, where there is one main path, but there's all kinds of stuff to do on the side that can always lead you back through it without having to just backtrack. Additionally impressive because the warping between bonfires is now open from the beginning of the game again like Dark Souls 2, but shortcuts are now actually useful. Item placement is also pretty decently considered, and while I haven't really found that many items in the early game that actually allow for A or even B scaling, most of the weapons seem at least somewhat more useful than they were in Dark Souls 2, which had all of its good items just stuffed away behind a ton of different levels. Unfortunately, enemy placement isn't as good this time around. Enemy placement in the early levels is great. Instead of just mobbing the player with a bunch of hard dudes that have a lot of status effects and hit really hard and fast, usually allowing skilled players to actually dissect certain parts of a level and take care of threats based on what they think is the most appropriate response, making getting through a level actually rewarding once you kill everything in it instead of frustrating because you know you're just going to end up running past everybody, beelining for all the items in the fog door. However, later on, most levels sort of just evolve into placing a lot of enemies or a lot of tough enemies and big mobs that are more annoying to deal with than they are actually skillful or challenging. This is one of the big problems I had with Dark Souls 2 because Dark Souls 2's entire enemy placement philosophy was just to place a bunch of dudes in a small area and let the player figure it out for themselves. Dark Souls' combat system works far better with one-on-one engagements or engagements with one or two enemies rather than having 4 or 5 guys swarm a player all at once. Our camera lock-on is incredibly heavy and focuses on one person, and most attacks the player can do while able to hit multiple enemies, sure, usually aren't designed for that kind of thing. There's also nothing mechanically interesting about fighting more people. The only difference between having one tough armored dude and having 2 tough armored dudes is the amount of uptime the player can actually attack in. Having the amount of time that the player can actually attack is not actually that interesting. It just means that the player takes twice as long to kill something. Placing multiple of the same enemy instead of making a more interesting encounter is basically just a cheap way to get the game to be harder instead of actually well designed. Because obviously Dark Souls is only meant to be difficult instead of a really good RPG, right? Before we move on to our next topic, I want to talk about one last thing with the level design, and that's the storytelling. Dark Souls' world storytelling has always been really amazing. At least Dark Souls 1's was. The placement of a lot of items usually was there to tell a story, such as what happened or what we assume happened with Kirk, what happened to Black Iron Tarkus, and the text on the doll that allows you to go into the painted world. Now this may just be my personal experience, but I didn't find anything like this. Most of the sets of armor I found were usually in some kind of chest as opposed to an actual corpse. And while there appears to be something going on with Farron's poison swamp and magic users, I don't really remember having the story of any phantoms told to me or anything like that. And yes, I did go back and look at all the items I owned and I read all of their descriptions and I still feel this way. The only NPC I'm not explicitly talking to and actually has any kind of story described in their items is Maneater Mildred 2.0, who drops the axe. However, the placement of props in Dark Souls 3 is actually pretty neat. Most of the time, instead of just being debris for players to roll through and destroy, a lot of times props will be placed in such a way that actually makes it feel like a world. Especially here in Yorv's High Wall, where a lot of chairs and things will be placed in locations where you could actually see somebody using them before everything in this location went to hell. My favorite being this open room here with the Lothric Knight. However, once again, this sort of gets thrown away later on in the game where levels seem to have less and less props and also seem to get shorter and shorter. I submit as evidence the Profane Capital, which is literally a hallway, 3 rooms full of enemies, and a boss door. Speaking of boss doors, let's talk about bosses in this game. Visually, the bosses in Dark Souls 3 are a little bit samey. Dark Souls 2 had this problem, and in fact, this problem actually exists not only in just the bosses, but for a lot of the enemies in the game as well. A vast majority of the bosses and an even vaster majority of the enemies you fight in Dark Souls 3 are usually just a dude in either tattered robes or armor. And for enemies, even when mechanically they're not functioning like just a dude in armor with some kind of weapon, they're still made up of some kind of humanoid part, like the human spider creatures in the Boreal Forest. And while mechanically this makes enemies very similar, at least the bosses are doing something really interesting this time around. From an actual mechanical standpoint, the bosses in this game are actually pretty varied, all doing something really neat. I can only really think of 2 bosses that don't do anything really that interesting. The Borean Dancer and Pontiff Sullivan. It's a good thing too, because the bosses in this game really aren't all that difficult. I killed a number of bosses on my first try. The only ones really killing me repeatedly are the Grave Watchers, Aldrich, and Pontiff Sulivan. I actually consider Pontiff Sulivan's fight to be the worst one, considering he doesn't do anything interesting other than swinging around two swords, and just seems like he was designed to be the hard fight. And I can tell I'm not the only one who had a lot of trouble with him because of the absolute sheer number of summoning signs I found when I went human in this area. His entire fight is basically just him having too much stamina and then spawning another him halfway in. This boss actually holds the record for the amount of attacks I've ever seen one enemy do in a single string at 9. Second place being held by his, or I guess its, knights at 7. See, the thing about a long combo is that it's not an interesting mechanic to deal with because it just revolves around you either blocking for a while and hoping you don't run out of stamina or just rolling a bunch. But aside from him, most bosses are doing something cool. For example, Vort of the Borean Tundra walks around like a dog and breathes ice. Yorm the Giant requires you to use a special sword that has an incredibly so special attack that you need to kill him, and the Grave Watchers can spawn Grave Watchers that attack them instead of you that you can use as a sort of semi-ally. Far more interesting than Dark Souls 2's bosses, which were basically just the same thing over and over and over again. However, difficulty isn't what makes a good Souls boss. Interesting mechanics is. Something like Dancer sure is hard because it does a lot of damage, but it's not as cool as Vonir. He teleports you into the abyss and has you attack certain parts of him. Dancer is just a straightforward fight that has a lot of spam. Speaking of things that are straightforward and have a lot of spam, an unfortunate carryover from Dark Souls 2 is that many boss doors just have a hallway full of enemies preceding them. One of the best things about Dark Souls and Demon Souls was that if you died at a boss, you had to respawn at your bonfire, and usually traverse most of the level and get back to the boss in good enough health to actually kill it. Sure, a lot of people were able to just run through a lot of the enemies, but encouraging this kind of behavior through your level design does not fix the problem. Your player should have to go back through about half the level or so, or actually have some amount of challenge after getting killed by the boss. That's their punishment. They have to go back through part of the level again. Placing them at a bonfire 30 feet away from the boss room with 4 enemies near it does not challenge make. You may as well just remove the hallway and just put the fog door right next to the bonfire at that point. However, from a mechanical standpoint, this is the only problem I really have with the level design in Dark Souls 3. The only other problem I have with Dark Souls 3 is actually my main problem with Dark Souls 3, which we'll get into later. We've talked about fighting a lot of bosses in Dark Souls 3, so how is the combat this time around? Combat has a lot of new additions that I think really shake up the formula in a good way. Primarily the way Estus now work. Estus can be allotted to either be used as a healing item or as a magic restoration item. It's a great way to limit both your healing and your magic use in the same way that Estus limited healing back in Dark Souls 1. Additionally, Dark Souls 3 gets rid of all the extra healing items that Dark Souls 2 introduced, meaning that healing now actually has to be considered seriously, as does magic use. Dark Souls 3 also introduces weapon skills. Weapon skills basically have it so that your weapons provide some kind of special attribute or some kind of special unique move that you can only do if you're two-handing them or using a shield that also has the weapon skill. For example, my longsword can have me dash forward and stab people, but my greatsword lets me step on people. However, I think weapon skills truly shine with shields. Basically, parry is now a weapon skill, meaning that if you want a different weapon skill, you can't parry with your shield. And especially in the early game when most classes don't have a 100% physical blocking shield, it can be an interesting choice that the player has to make. Do they want to be able to block more reliably, or do they want to be able to occasionally get some crits? Aside from that, combat seems more or less the same from Dark Souls 1. Maybe it's a little bit floatier and a little bit more like Bloodborne, but again, I wouldn't really know. I'm not sure about balance for PvP, but personally I think it's kind of stupid to talk about PvP since that's going to be an ever-changing landscape, meaning that everything I say now may not be the case in a month. Since we're still on the topic of gameplay and online interaction, I think the last thing we really need to talk about is the Covenant system, which seems that it's just been given up on. Covenants are now just represented by a very small piece of interchangeable cloth in the player's inventory. Basically, you can just switch out your cloth and you've already switched out your faction. Very simple. While this is very nice and very convenient, I don't like the way it's being handled. Covenants were never good in Dark Souls, but they seem to be getting worse as time goes on. In Dark Souls 1, most Covenants didn't ever explain what they were to you. However, when you joined, it was sort of like signing an agreement. Basically, if you join the Covenant and you do what they want you to do, you'll get some kind of cool rewards specific to that Covenant. And if you leave a Covenant, you'll suffer some kind of consequence. Dark Souls 2 kept half of this by making it so that if you joined a Covenant and did what they wanted, they'd give you rewards, but there were no consequences for leaving any Covenants in Dark Souls 2. Basically, in Dark Souls 2, you just left Covenants and joined other ones to make the game slightly more convenient for yourself. Dark Souls 3 seems to have abandoned this notion. All the Covenants seem to do is just act as Covenants and nothing more. You don't seem to get any kind of rewards or suffer any kind of consequences if you leave or join or do what the Covenant wants you. The Covenants are also all repeated, so they're not even something new from the story perspective. And I think that that's all I really want to say about Dark Souls 3 mechanically. I mean, as a game, Dark Souls 3 is a pretty great game. It's worth your $60, and I imagine if I can get the online working, it'll be worth even more than that. And I kind of want to separate the video here. If you just want to know about whether or not you should buy Dark Souls 3 from a purely gameplay perspective, if you just want another Dark Souls game, go ahead and just stop the video now. I would say you can make a confident confident purchase that you are buying something better than Dark Souls 2 was. However, for those of us who still care about the story, the character interactions, and all the little things about Dark Souls, continue on. Dark Souls 3 is a good game. It is, however, not a good Dark Souls game. Everything about it feels repetitive, and it feels tired. It's a clear sign of stagnation for the Dark Souls series, which has basically written itself into a corner. It's exactly what happens when you force someone to work in the same universe for 3 games when they only probably wanted to work in it for 1. It's very clear they didn't have enough actual new substance to sustain an entire new game, which is why Dark Souls 3 reborrows and reuses so much stuff from Dark Souls 1. The world, the plotline, and even some characters are directly copy-pasted out of the first game, and some other characters are re-included under a new name, such as Siegward of Katarina, who's totally different from Siegmeyer of Katarina because he's a dopey idiot who goes on a lot of adventures, just like Siegmeyer of Katarina. Or quite literally just Patches, and Andre, and the Man in Black, all once again. The game feels repetitive. It feels like I've been here before, and it feels like Dark Souls 3 just wants to go through the motions to get over with to be a Dark Souls game. I forewarned myself earlier in this video that I should be watching out for repetitive plot points and repeated things in this game, and here they are. There's absolutely no reason this game should have reused as much stuff unless Miyazaki and his team were just being lazy, or if Bamco rushed them and they had to be lazy. The adverse effect of having all this stuff be repeated is that it makes veteran players like me feel like we're just doing the same thing again, down to the very fine details. Dark Souls 2 did this too, but at least it actually felt like its own game because it had different characters and slightly different lore and a slightly different theme and a newer kingdom, and they had the fair enough decency to at least give a new voice actor and a new name to all the old characters. But even in that game, with the absolute sheer amount of analogous story and plot lines, felt like it was its own thing. Not a good thing, but its own thing. Dark Souls 3 has absolutely no identity of its own. All of the enemies are just generic dudes in either tatters or armor wielding big weapons that all look the same and start to blend together after a while. Most of the locations are either incredibly easily compared to other locations from previous entries of the series or are just blatantly stolen from them. They didn't bother to come up with any new factions or covenants in the entire game. Gear and weapons are reused in droves, down to their very icons being lifted out of Dark Souls 2, and certain enemies and even certain areas being reused from Dark Souls 1, obviously just to pander to nostalgia. At this point in the story, the Age of Fire is supposed to be some kind of ritualistic thing that people are doing every once in a while to prevent the ages from dying. We've had time to build up an entire new kingdom and to build an entire new shrine out of Firelink, but somehow Solaire's very specific set of armor that only he used is still available from birds, and various factions from the previous game are just re-included only for their functionality instead of being replaced by something possibly more interesting or more efficient. All this game had to do to fix the covenants from Dark Souls 1 would be to explain what they are to the player from a gameplay perspective right when they walk up to whoever wants them to join, to provide balanced rewards between each faction, and to make it so there's some kind of harsh penalty for removing yourself from a faction. But instead they decided to take the effortless easy route and just make it so you can switch in between each faction with a stupid piece of paper in its own equipable slot. And they couldn't even bother making it an actually new faction. We reused the Warriors of the Sun because everybody needs to see the Warriors of the Sun to know it's Dark Souls, and we can reuse the Way of the White and the Way of Blue because we already did those in previous games, so we may as well just do them again, right? It's not even just the story elements of this game that feel repetitive. Certain segments of gameplay also feel like they were lifted out of the Dark Souls What Everybody Did Once handbook, like having the player run across an incredibly thin catwalk while being shot at by Silver Knights with great bows, and giving the player the ability to stand under a bridge to save themselves from the fire of an upwards dragon and shoot at them with a bow. Perhaps you could say this is to give new players the same sense of adventure that Dark Souls 1 players had back when they first played that game. But obviously this can't be the case because a new player hasn't yet had explained to them what the Age of Fire exactly is or why it's good. Also, you're never going to give a new player the exact same experience that an old player of Dark Souls 1 was going to get. Why would you do that when you could give everybody a new adventure by creating an entirely new game with more unique, identifiable elements that actually make up a whole new Dark Souls game instead of just making another Dark Souls? As a veteran player, I should be expecting just as much new adventure as a new player would be expecting. I mean, sure, I expect them to reuse a couple of weapons or armor sets here and there, and I obviously know the mechanics already, but I still expect some sense of adventure, of which Dark Souls 3 has absolutely none. I mean, to be fair, this is the Dark Souls game where you're not allowed to choose where you're supposed to go at first, and you simply start where FromSoft tells you, instead of having a world design design that interconnects upon itself and allows a player to skip to certain areas from other areas, and to loop back around again. Every area simply leads to another area. Like this is Mario. Dark Souls 1's massive, seamless open world was one of the best things about that game, coming from Demon Souls in my personal opinion. And while Dark Souls 3 sure does allow you to go from one area to another without loading, that's pretty much all you can do. You can't go in between areas. You go from one place to the next, to the next, to the next, as if you were following a road, which has another adverse effect on that supposed adventure we're supposed to be having for new players. When Dark Souls 1 started off with multiple occasions, it trusted that the player had enough intelligence to stop going to the place that was getting them killed. But now in Dark Souls 3 we don't seem to have that much trust in the player, and we're basically just going to start them off where we think they should go and let them figure it out from there. Excuse me, I misspoke, I mean not figure it out from there. Beside the point that Dark Souls 3 is already trampling all over the point and plot of Dark Souls 1 and simply reusing everything it can from that game without sheer plagiarism, Dark Souls 3's plotline is also handled far more poorly than it was in the first game. In Dark Souls 1, we were given the task of a dying man who saved our lives to go and ring the bell of awakening because we think something good will happen. He tells us a family story about the legacy of the undead, about a prophecy of how the undead, both us and him, are destined to go out and seek the bells of awakening where we'll know our true cause. This is a pretty great motivation for both characters and players alike, because it's the dying request and last words of a guy who just broke you out of the worst jail on Earth. To this end, we escape the undead asylum and go out and actually seek the bells of awakening themselves, but we don't know where they are. So being the actual useful character he was in Dark Souls 1, the crestfallen warrior actually tells us where we should be looking. After we go out and ring both bells, we come back to the shrine because we have no idea what we're supposed to be looking for, and we go back and we see Frampt, who explains to us that the Age of Fire can once again be rekindled by our hands, which we as a player know is generally a good thing because we're explained it in the opening cutscene. Frampt sends us to acquire the Lord Vessel, and explains to us that with the Lord Vessel we can collect all of the souls of the Lords and go and enter the Kiln of the First Flame to once again bring about the Age of Fire. I know that there's a lot more to Dark Souls' plot than that, and I'll get into that later, but for a new player, for your first time, that's basically the gist. In Dark Souls 3, we're never explained what exactly the Age of Fire is or why we should like it. The opening cinematic doesn't even so much as provide a picture or a description of what the Age of Fire is supposed to be like to give a new player any amount of reason to care about it. You're just supposed to accept that the Age of Fire is a good thing without knowing anything about it. You wake up from being dead, and then you go kill a random dude in armor, and then you walk into some kind of circle that has 4 random people dotted all around it. Then, if you so choose, you talk to this goofy fucker here, and it gives you some cryptic pseudo-medieval dialogue about how you need to go and find the other 3 lords and kill them, about how he's also a lord and he's not going to move away from his throne just in case, just to make your life a little bit easier. So then, on a hunch that the Age of Fire is a good thing that you want, you go out and kill the hallowed remains of 3 of the most powerful beings in the land. Once you're done with that, you get contacted by some woman you talked to maybe like 20 hours ago, who for some inexplicable reason decides to teleport you right out of one boss encounter into another, probably just to get you killed. She explains that you need to go find the prince. We kill the Boreal Dancer, assumably because he killed her, or it killed her. We then go through Lothric Castle, fight another dude in armor, but this time with air support. Once we find the prince, he actually gives us a pretty interesting ultimatum. He tells us that for some reason he also doesn't like the fact that the Age of Fire has been persisting so much, and that we should just give up and let it fade. The only interesting thing I find about this, which I think makes it wholly interesting, is the fact that the game suggests that you just stop playing and have that be your ending. Now that might just be my own warped interpretation of what this person is trying to get across here, but I'm going to just assume that that's what the game wants me to do for now because I have no evidence to suggest otherwise. Now assuming that this is the case and these bosses really would rather just have the player give up, I personally would have made it so these bosses weren't hostile at the beginning of their fight. Like Lorien never just jumps on the player immediately. If the player just decides not to fight them, then they just decide not to fight them and that's it. That being the give up ending. Like obviously the player wouldn't be able to progress the rest of the game because they haven't killed Lorien, and if they do attack Lorien, then obviously they're going for the Length of Fire ending. Unfortunately this is not the case, and Lorien just attacks the player like any other boss. Now because we promised to see this game through and through, I'm going to kill Lorien and move on. We kill Lorien, who alone has a pretty good fight, and then he's like resurrected by his brother, and then you have to fight them both at the same time, and Lothric gives us a little speech about how we're going to remain accursed. And now we have all the kindlings of all the lords, so we're done, right? Well, almost. And as if we didn't already take enough things from Dark Souls 1, this game also ends at the Kiln of the First Flame, which of course we traveled to through teleportation, even though if this is Firelink Shrine, and this is the killing of the first flame, we should have just gone down some stairs. Anyway, we go and kill the Soul of Cinder, which is some random dude in armor, like a skeleton with a falchion or something, who after an entire boss fight literally just turns into Gwyn. I'm not even kidding. He copies his moveset, he copies his music. It's pathetic. Remember how I said Pontiff Sullivan was the worst fight in this game? Guess what? I lied, because the first phase of his fight is just a bunch of player movesets, and then the second phase of his fight is literally another boss from the previous games. But it's not just any boss, it's Gwyn. The reason that the Gwyn fight works so well in Dark Souls 1 is because you knew who Gwyn was. His role in the world was explained as one of the four lords in the opening cinematic, and around the world, in a lot of often thematically important moments, he was mentioned, or at least obviously associated. Like the fight with Ornstein and Smough, where a statue of his is clearly visible inside the boss room, and afterwards, if you read the armor sets of the people that you just killed, you'll learn that Ornstein was one of Gwyn's 4 super knights. But not only that, right after you defeat Ornstein and Smough, you meet Gwyn's, or a vision of Gwyn's daughter, or family member of some description, Guinevere. Not only that, if you explore around Anor Londo more, you can find the fight with Dark Sun Gwyndolin. You can see him using the lightning spears, so when you use a lightning spear in the game, you can immediately assume that he has something to do with their creation. And Frampt, a character we talked to a lot in Dark Souls 1, worked under him, and the task that he actually gives us is to replace him. The fight that leads up to Gwyn is not only thematically important, but even thematically interesting when you actually get inside the fight, because as strong as Gwyn was, and as strong as what's left of him is, you realize this is just the husk of what was once a much mightier opponent. He's the only boss in that entire game that can actually be parried, which shows just how weak Gwyn has gotten, and just how weak maybe the rest of the entire world has gotten with him. It almost makes you feel like you're putting the old man down, which helps to make the fight incredibly depressing, just like the rest of Dark Souls 1. This fight has none of that. Assuming you never played Dark Souls 1, this Soul of Cinder guy just comes out of nowhere and seems to just respawn his own health bar. This music means nothing to someone who's never heard it in Gwyn's fight, and his moveset also means nothing to someone who's never fought Gwyn. And to people who have played Dark Souls 1, this just comes off as soulless pandering to try to get you to remember how much greater that game was than this one is. And then the game ends the exact same way Dark Souls 1 ends for the vast majority of people who first played that game. You sacrifice yourself supposedly to the fire so that you can rebirth the Age of Fire once again. The credits roll and you're over. Now I decided to go and look on the Wikipedia to find the other endings to this game because I knew for a fact there had to at least be a couple. Luckily there are, and however they suck. They're all just cryptic and stupid, and honestly they don't matter. The only Dark Souls game's ending that actually ever mattered was Dark Souls 1. So now that we've gotten through the story of Dark Souls 3, let me just make one little minor criticism before I get into that thing I told you about earlier. Dark Souls 3's storyline is so boring. Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2 storylines usually had at least one main character interacting with them at certain points in the game after certain events had happened. Let me contrast the Maid in Green from Dark Souls 2 and the Maid in Black in Dark Souls 3. All the Maid in Black in Dark Souls 3 tells us is to warp into Lordaeron or Lothric or whatever the hell we're calling it now, and then to warp back out over to the Firelink Shrine. In Dark Souls 2, the Maid in Green actually appears in multiple places and helps the player in more ways than just leveling up. She appears once in the Dragon Area and then once right before the end of the game to help explain her story a little bit. Of course, that doesn't save Dark Souls 2's story any, but at least it's there. Dark Souls 3's story is just a repeat of the first game, without even understanding what the theme of the first game was. This is the point I wanted to make about Dark Souls 1's plot that I didn't make earlier. Dark Souls 1 has two endings, the Link the Fire ending, and the Age of Mankind ending. Dark Souls 1's entire game was about an age, and possibly even this entire kingdom and surrounding kingdoms all together. The whole world may even be ending. Dark Souls 1 talked a lot about fire. Bonfires were where you respawned, Estus flasks are orange. The current time that we're operating in is called the Age of Fire, and an entire new branch of magic was born in the form of pyromancy. This isn't just an aesthetic choice, however, there's a thematic reason that this is the case. Dark Souls 1's entire message was that eventually everything is going to die. Nothing lasts forever. Fire is an obviously good analogy for this because fires don't last forever. Eventually, they have to burn out. Embers being a sign of a fire that's dying, and ash being the sign of what was fire. That's why the kiln of the first flame is such a powerful area in Dark Souls 1. Everything in the entire place is covered in ash, to signify the fact that not only is this marking the end of the game, but also the fact that this is pretty much marking the end of the world. The kiln of the first flame was probably once a place of incredibly bright fires, and is now nothing more than a wasteland full of ruins and ash. And just in case that message wasn't entirely clear for a player, the boss of that area is Gwyn. Gwyn, the once mighty Lord of Cinder, now turned into just a hollow like everybody else. Just like fire fire, Gwyn eventually was going to die too, and just like fire, the Age of Fire was eventually going to burn itself out. Every major lore character, aside from Frampton the player, that attempted to relink the fire and keep the Age of Fire going had some kind of horrible fate befall them, like the Witch of Izalith who got turned into the bed of chaos. That's why the Link the Fire ending in Dark Souls 1 is perceived as the bad one. Frampton is just tricking the player into relighting the Age of Fire, knowing very well that this will all repeat itself. No matter how strong the player's character was, they would never be able to sustain the Age of Fire forever. Eventually, the darkness would consume the world no matter what anybody has to say about it, and Framp's attempts at keeping the fire going by adding more and more fuel to it are pointless and foolish, because it can't go on forever. That's why ushering in the Age of Mankind is seen as the better option for the world of Dark Souls 1, to finally put the Age of Fire to rest and begin anew. And while the depressing thing is that one day the Age of Mankind will also fade, at least the reality of this has been accepted. Dark Souls 3 reuses this entire plotline without actually understanding this. Apparently the Age of Fire will never end as long as we sacrifice enough people to it, and I can't tell why they went this route. Either Miyazaki is lazy, or Bamco didn't want him to actually put in any work to make an entirely different Dark Souls game, possibly to avoid the community backlashing against Dark Souls 3 not being Dark Souls 1+1. Or maybe this is some kind of brilliant meta-commentary, showing that this series' slow degradation from Dark Souls 1 is a result of trying to keep that game going on forever. Perhaps a little bit of revenge on Miyazaki's part at Namco for making him work on the same game 3 times. Or maybe Miyazaki knew that if he actually tried to make a new game, an entirely new game with a new message, then people wouldn't accept it, because everybody knows if you ask someone what they want, all they want is a better thing of what they already have. Or maybe I'm reading far too into this and Miyazaki is just uncreative and didn't have anything for the third game. Considering Bloodborne, a game that actually decided to detach itself from the Dark Souls franchise, actually was a pretty great success and has a pretty decent story that I've read up on instead of played, I'm going to place my dubious trust in Miyazaki and say that this is actually just meta instead of bad. There was never supposed to be a Dark Souls 2, the same way that there never should have been a Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls was never meant to be a franchise. The very story goes against the notion of there being sequels to Dark Souls that have anything to do with Dark Souls. And if there had to exist a Dark Souls 2 and 3, the best you could have done is made their stories have nothing to do with Dark Souls 1 and to have their own messages away from that game. Unfortunately, we haven't. Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3 just blindly reuse things and elements from Dark Souls 1 without having the same meaning, which means either that Dark Souls 2 and 3 never had a theme, or that they're going with the same theme from Dark Souls 1, which makes them hypocrites. Though I know deep down that it's probably the former, that Dark Souls 3 never had a theme and never was going to have a theme at any point in development. This game just feels like it's going through the motions for Dark Souls at this point. It wildly reuses the same characters, the same story, the same areas, certain gameplay encounters, and even a boss. Dark Souls 3 just feels incredibly phoned in, and it's very clear that at this point Dark Souls has become creatively bankrupt. So much so that even halfway into the game it starts to reuse its own enemies instead of just enemies from previous Dark Souls games. The entirety of Lothar Castle introduces one new enemy in the form of the healing priests, every other enemy just being a buffed up version of the normal soldiers from the earlier levels. And it's not just that one area that does this. The Grand Archive also reuses the small dudes from the Undead Settlement. And then to cap it all off, we reuse Gwyn as the final boss. Except that it's not Gwyn, it's Gwyn again. And that right there almost signifies exactly what I hate about this game, is that it's just Dark Souls again, when Dark Souls was never supposed to have an again. Like I said way earlier in this video, I prefer it when the Dark Souls games actually strike out with their own vision and have their own theme and their own world and their own continents and their own characters, completely detached from previous entries. Because Dark Souls 1 wasn't a game that was supposed to be built up with a sequel, it was supposed to end. And it's quite ironic and quite sad that this is what happened to the series. It's almost like we took the Link the Fire ending in real life, constantly trying to rekindle everyone's love for Dark Souls 1 instead of just going out and doing our own new thing. Dark Souls 3 embodies this in every way. It lacks the story, the adventure, and the interesting characters from Dark Souls 1, and it spends way too much time constantly trying to remind the player that Dark Souls 1 exists instead of trying to be its own thing. I don't believe I've ever seen this much pandering in a video game before, and I hope I never see it again. My eyes may have well just rolled out of my head the moment I saw the Iron Helm and the Xanthos crown once again for no inexplicable reason other than the fact that they were in Dark Souls 1. And that's basically the entire game. It just exists the way it does because Dark Souls 1 exists and everyone really likes Dark Souls 1, so we better do it again. Mechanically, I can't complain about Dark Souls 3. It's a good video game, don't get me wrong. Once this video is over, I plan on starting up a new character that's more inclined towards PvP and trying to figure out if I can fix the animations, and getting back into the Dark Souls I know and love, because at the end of the day, I'm probably the only person who cares about the first time playthrough in the story of Dark Souls 3 when everyone really just wants to get to the PvP so they can make their awesome montage videos. However, Dark Souls 1 to me was a lot more than just a game on my first playthrough. It felt like a world. It felt like an actual adventure because the world made sense, physically intertwining in multiple ways, dotted with characters that I could meet and help and watch die as I journey across the land. It opened up with a lot of player choice and allowed me to tackle my objectives the way I wanted. It was an incredibly massive game that trusted that the player would have to figure out everything about it on their own without any kind of help, and originally was one of the best stories I'd ever seen in a video game, not just in the main story but in the way it told all of its little side stories. The world building in Dark Souls 1 was fantastic, the lore was great, and the story was awesome, because it was consistent and it meant something. Dark Souls 3 doesn't mean anything. Dark Souls 3's story doesn't mean anything unless this actually is some kind of meta commentary about how Dark Souls should have never had a sequel. I'm going to be positive and just assume that it is. And even if it is, everything else about Dark Souls 3 has just become so formulaic. Probably because after the third game, people might get a little tired of this exact structure being followed over and over and over again. Especially problematic because for the last two games, we've unnecessarily reused things that didn't need to be reused from the first game. If Dark Souls 2 and 3 had drastically different and more creative stories, worlds, and lore than Dark Souls 1, and more than they already have, I would be fine with recurring gameplay mechanics and level design and other parts of the formula. I expect the game to play the same as Dark Souls 1 did, at least relatively so, but I also want to see a new story that doesn't make this game feel like it's Dark Souls 1. I want another game that feels like it's in the Dark Souls universe. I don't want another Dark Souls 1. I hate to quote Matthew Matosis here, but what he said of Dark Souls 2 is the same of Dark Souls 3. The main problem with Dark Souls 3 is that it has no fucking soul. Dark Souls 3 could have been great. It could have been truly a third Dark Souls game, one with its own story and world and new characters that mystify the experience the same way Dark Souls 1 did. New and old players alike could samely experience a new magical look into the world of Dark Souls, but instead what we're doing is mirroring Dark Souls 1 for veteran players and providing a poorly explained and motivationless story for newer players who don't know about Dark Souls 1. Perhaps my thoughts on this are just partially being born from the fact that I've played Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2 already, and even though I played Dark Souls 3 the same way I played Dark Souls 1 and 2, actually going around and adventuring and exploring, it just doesn't feel the same. Doubly ironic because it feels too samey. Like I've said over and over again in this video, Dark Souls 3 is just Dark Souls 1 again, and that's the problem. The only way the Dark Souls series is going to stop stagnating this way is if we actually stop making Dark Souls 1 and decide to go on with some new lore, abandoning everything with fire. Just imagine for yourself, if you will, a Dark Souls game that doesn't reuse bonfires and the Age of Fire and all this other crap. The same game but with an entirely new experience. I want that Dark Souls game to exist, but unfortunately I doubt it ever will. At least not while it's called Dark Souls. I imagine that the best thing I can hope for is that From Software leaves Bamco Studios behind and goes on to create another series of Souls games under a new name that actually has some creativity to them. Bloodborne is proof that this formula can work if you just shake up the story, and Dark Souls 3 is proof that when you don't shake up the story, you risk just being a repetitive iteration of your first game, which is exactly what Dark Souls 3 is. As far as whether or not you should purchase this game, here's my thoughts on it. It's Dark Souls again. Whatever that means to you, it means to you. I know for a lot of people, all of what I've just talked about probably doesn't matter, which is why I put the disclaimer halfway into this video. Again, if you're just looking for a purely mechanical Dark Souls game, you're gonna find this and you're gonna love this. But if you're one of the people like me who was concerned about the finer details of Dark Souls, well then you're not going to find anything new here. And that's just the tragic thing, isn't it? A new Dark Souls game with nothing new in it. And hopefully this will be the last one too. Maybe, just maybe if I'm lucky, Dark Souls will either reinvigorate itself with an entirely new game, or, much like a fire, will eventually burn itself out. I just want to give a quick thanks to everybody who made it to this point in the video. I know a lot of people don't really like watching longer critique videos, they're not exactly as popular as quicker ones that generalize the entire game that they're playing, so when I see people have actually watched through the whole video, I get a little giddy inside. Hopefully it means I'm doing a good enough job of entertaining people for the next, like, 40 minutes. If you'd like, you could probably find some other videos of mine if you like this one, like in the sidebar, you know, you can click on them if you want. I'm not gonna tell you what to do. And if you have a problem with this video or you want to tell me that I'm doing a good job, tell me so in the comment section, because that's the only place where I can actually, like respond and learn. If you just, dislike the video, I don't know what the fuck just disliking the video means. I don't know what the fuck that does. Hell, if you don't like this video, you shouldn't dislike it, because that makes it go up higher in YouTube search rankings. So you're just helping people see it. That's not good. That's not what you want if you don't like me. That's dumb. And I think that's all I have to say for now, because I'm, kind of tired. I'm gonna go get some water because my throat is really fucking dry and I think I have strep, so, you know, see ya.